Hey everybody, dustincathro here. Today we're going to be doing something a little different. We're going to be reviewing an essay from Carl Jung's book here. It's a modern man in search of a soul. So right here we're going to be talking about essay number 8, which is also chapter number 8, and it's actually just called Psychology and Literature. And what it's kind of explaining is it's explaining psychology's relationship with art. In the essence, it's talking about the achievement of art by human beings and how we can understand not only psychologically art through a process by evaluating it through essentially symbolism, but it can also be a way to view the personality and the person behind the art. And kind of understanding these two things can help us understand a little bit about the soul. So Carl Jung kind of explains how we can understand art through these two processes. The first one is viewing the process of art through this thing called the psychological creation. What this means is that the rules that govern reality and the experience that we know consciously is essentially a way that we can view art. And what this can mean is human destiny, for example, or things that are within the realm of possibility from our conscious understanding, and things that kind of have a linear or logical kind of way to make sense of the world. And so we can see this in a lot of books like psychological thrillers, for example, how it can be very clear what exactly is happening, and we find satisfaction in this understanding of why, X is a serial killer because Y happened, and now they are committing these crimes. And it's kind of like this cognitive logical process behind the psychological creation. And so people can understand that, and they can really get behind art and literature that kind of backs that up. But then there's this other process that happens, and this is kind of the one that's a little more intriguing for the psychologist or for Jung. And this is called the visionary creation. And visionary creation can best be described as breaking the boundaries of the conscious reality, because the process is an unconscious one that the artist is creating. And this unconscious creation can reveal deep meaning and symbolic things. So, for example, a dream or a nightmare, they sometimes don't make logical sense, and so they live in this other realm of creation that is separate from our consciousness, and it's our unconscious. And what he is trying to say is a book like Dante's Inferno, for example, is a very symbolic and very certain type of process that's not exactly in the conscious world, but rather in something that exists inside of us and not something in the reality that we know. And so this can be a really interesting kind of idea when we start looking at art with these two different visions. This kind of opens up a door to talk about where creativity comes from. Art has this way of being a very elusive type of thing that people just do, but we don't really know where creativity comes from. And I think by using these two processes that Jung kind of talks about, we can kind of get a feel that the human psyche is really responsible in some sense for this creativity and how it's generated. Though some artists may live more in the conscious world through their art, and others in the unconscious, and others blending it together, depending on the artist. But it's hard to ignore that there are ways that people kind of generate their creativity. And so trying to find or understand like where that comes from is interesting, especially when you start talking about not just the art, but the artist, him or herself. For example, Goethe, he uses this reference in the book, and his play by Faust. It has some interesting things that kind of reference potentially Goethe's mother, and how maybe he did this unconsciously or maybe consciously, but that now that we know a little bit about Goethe and the history of his play Faust, we can kind of talk about who he is and how that also plays a role in his art. And you got to separate the art from the artist. We say this all the time, but at the same time, there is always a piece of them in there. Maybe something unconscious or conscious they might be leaving a message, a little trail behind, kind of thing, breadcrumb trail. So I think that it's a really interesting thing to think about, how the conscious and unconscious experience kind of plays a role in art. And it's hard to kind of grasp art because it is a very elusive kind of form, but it's a very human thing at the same time, because people really appreciate art in a lot of ways. Like a play, a movie, a novel, quite physical art, drawing, painting. It all kind of lands differently with people, but it all says something. It says some sort of common unconscious thing, and that's, I kind of think, what Jung is getting at, that there's this common unconscious trope almost to art, and there's also something that we don't quite grasp, and that's kind of the soul. I think that's what he's trying to say in this chapter, is that the thing that we can't grasp is the soul. It's this very elusive, complicated thing, and we're always searching for it. And I think that the artist can sometimes find this thing that we're searching for, and they can sometimes express this thing that we're searching for, that we're longing for. And I think that it's a very romantic kind of idea in itself. Saying it out loud now, I'm like, it's a bit of a romanticizing idea about art, that it's a longing for this thing, and maybe that's a very human thing to say at the same time. So I think that it's something that we can talk about and think about. Art is a very elusive, and I think we're all longing for some sort of connection to our humanity. And I think Jung's really trying to capture this. This is my own words, but that's, I think, what he's trying to say. Something I found very interesting about this chapter is Jung is trying to say that our unconscious developed into our consciousness, and that our consciousness has a root in symbolism. And I think that this is a really interesting and very primitive kind of point. And it's, when you read it and you kind of hear it out loud, it's like, oh yeah, that has to be true. That our conscious reality is so shaped by our unconscious. And I mean this in the sense that the symbols that once ruled our life as more of a primitive creature, going on evolution a bit here of our psychological process, is that we assume a lot by what we see, and we put a lot of faith in our consciousness. And when something happens to us that breaks that trust in our consciousness, I think that our unconscious really picks that up, and something deep within it, you go to look for it somewhere else, though, into the symbolic realm. You're manifesting something kind of in yourself. Maybe it's something like an anxiety or a depression, and maybe there's not really any conscious evidence of this happening, but you can feel this psychological process inside of you happening. And I think that it's just as real as the physical reality, because there's something symbolic potentially behind it. And maybe I'm misunderstanding. I'm not exactly an expert on Jung or an expert on psychology, but it's an interesting perspective and point of view to think about, that our consciousness had evolved from our unconsciousness, and that though it might not be the entirely univocal factor into the evolution of that, but it certainly has to be some part of it. And I think that's kind of what Jung is saying. He's not saying that, hey, this is where it came from, but he's like, this is definitely a part of it, and we shouldn't ignore the unconscious that we have, and the unexplainable things that happen in us that we feel, kind of thing. So I think it's pretty cool. I like this idea that creativeness kind of contains this secret that Jung's kind of talking about in the book. He's kind of just talking about that there's some sort of secret about creativity that we don't quite fathom and understand. And I think that the artists themselves might not understand it too. And I think it just kind of gives you these little glimmers and glimpses, rather, of something that's bigger than ourselves. And whether it's conscious or not, something bigger than ourselves is happening when we're creating things. And I think that's kind of a testament to the human spirit, in a sense. Jung's also kind of explaining why artists have these vices. And he kind of explains it because they're drawing on so much energy and creative power to do the thing that they do, that the cost of that, to hold on to any of their humanity, is to have some sort of vice that they hold on to. Maybe it's drinking or something like that. Then, and it's something that kind of holds them in reality. Because if they let go of that only small piece of reality that they have, they'll lose themselves to their art. And that having the vice is the crutch that keeps them in reality, just enough to keep the spark, is what he kind of calls it, like the spark to live on, because the art alone maybe is not enough to live on, and which is kind of an interesting idea in itself too, because they need to live on to create the art. And so it's like a necessary function, he's saying, to have the vice as something to lean onto, so that they can take on the burden of reality that they see through their eyes, which they, with it, which comes out in their art. So I kind of like this idea of the flawed artist that, must create their art, or it's just the end of them. And so they have these vices that hold them together. In a sense, they're kind of like a glue that holds them in reality while they live in, their fantasy land, essentially. But I don't mean that in a negative way either. I mean the fantasy as the symbolic. Continuing on with the vice idea, the cost of creativity is very high. Jung is kind of explaining that to lose yourself in what you do in that creative process is a very costly thing. And the true kind of artist that does that, with their painting or literature or music, is they put it all on the line, and it's not necessarily a choice that they have. They feel this calling to them to do this, and this calling is coming from the unconscious. It's letting people know, in the times, like what we all wish and believe and what we desire, and that the artist kind of has this job in society to create these things that we all need. And he kind of explains it for better or for worse. The artist creates it with no end goal in mind. They only create this kind of elusive truth that we either dare to know or hope it's not true, kind of thing. And I kind of like that idea in itself as well, that Jung's kind of saying a lot of us don't really know what is good for us, and so we look for it in forms of art, and that it helps us feel understanding and expressing ourselves, even through an artist's work. We kind of see parts of ourselves, and I think that that's the big draw to art and to movies, literature, all the things. I say art very loosely; it's a very broad, categorical imperative, but I think that it's drawing us all in. And I'm right here drawing myself into Jung's chapter 8, Psychology and Literature, and I feel like there's some sort of truth that he's tapping on here. Whether I know exactly what he's saying or not, I'm taking some sort of conscious process to reading what he's saying and trying to think about what he means. And I think that he's a very interesting character, Jung. I think that he has a very vast educational background. He's a physician. He's also a psychologist, and he has a love for history and theology. And there's not many men that are like Jung and had the kind of broad education in a lot of different fields. And I think that reading Jung can be really beneficial because he has such a big perspective and such a great visionary mind himself, I think. And so when I read Jung, I take my time, for one, because he's on another level. But I think that just trying to bark up the right tree on what he's trying to say is kind of the gist of this essay that I'm just trying to explain. I feel like I could talk about this essay for an hour, trying to unpack all the things that he's trying to express. So, Modern Man in Search of His Soul, everyone. That's kind of a little chapter 8 talk about art, and talk about the human spirit, essentially, the soul. Yeah, so till next time, guys, thanks for listening. Dustin Cathro here. Thanks. Cheers.